Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Grim Wisdom Podcast. Idea, as always, is we're going to open your mind to knowledge, and you're going to wish we hadn't. This is Sam Bell, who is with me today, and we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to talk about Rhode Island politics. We're going to talk about national politics. We're going to talk about our plans for this year and beyond in terms of politics, and I think we're going to find something really down and depressing to end the podcast on. Just something that'll crush any hope that you might have nurtured for the first.
And I'm going to be trying to build up some hope.
Yeah, Sam's going to try to build up some hope, and I'm going to try to crush it like a flower beneath my boot, as is fitting, I think. So let's begin. I think the biggest story that I want to talk about this week is the scandal on the State House. Chairman of the House Finance Committee, for those of you who aren't paying attention or who aren't in Rhode Island, Chairman of the House Finance Committee, the feds raided his office, and it's
his house, not his office.
His house. I thought they raided his house and his office.
No, they raided just his house.
I mean, I saw that picture. There's this great picture of him looking furtive and taking boxes out of his house. Yeah, I know they raided him back in March, but I thought I read that they raided his state offices because that's where the information was.
No, I don't believe his state offices have been raided. There was a tweet that a reporter sent out earlier this week saying, contrary to rumors, the State House is not being raided. Officers are just there for a ceremony.
Right, I remember that.
Which I think captures part of the spirit of Rhode Island.
Yeah, I mean
politically.
But I think the bottom line is that he's not currently under a federal indictment that we're aware of.
Right, but he is under investigation.
He is under investigation, and details are scanty, but it has something to do with prostitution, which I think is just too delicious for words. I want to go back and I want to see how he voted on that law a few years back that made prostitution illegal in Rhode Island.
Someone should do that.
Because that would be fascinating. Because that was, I think, a particularly vindictive move. Just to bring people up to speed on what we're talking about. When I first moved to Rhode Island, prostitution was legal, or rather, it was only illegal if it was outdoors and you couldn't advertise it. So it was okay to sell sex as long as it was indoors and you didn't.
But there were serious problems with that old system. It was heavily underregulated, it was full of abuses, and it was, as prostitution often is, a vehicle or a system in which there was extensive violence against women and sex trafficking. And it is not clear, of course, that the fully underground system has in any way fully addressed those problems at all.
Yeah.
But it's not like the Rhode Island's legalized system was a system that is as well functional as some of the other legalized systems where there are some protections for women.
I think even the word system gives it the lie. It was really the Wild West because of this bizarre loophole that said you could have prostitution, or rather it was only illegal if it was out of doors and it was illegal to advertise it, but it was totally okay to walk into a strip club and hire someone to perform services.
It was this weird system that both allowed prostitution to proliferate without any sort of legal prosecution, but also prevented regulation. So It was a system that wasn't able to capture the benefits of a fully legalized prostitution system.
Sure. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to advocate that it was great before. What I'm trying to say is that in the depths of the recession, when everybody was losing their jobs left and right, and the state was really struggling with the consequences of the recession, the State House decided, hey, we're going to take what we need to drop everything. We've just discovered that prostitution is legal in Providence, and this is a major big deal. That's going to be our major policy initiative for this year. So they pretended they hadn't been aware of it all along, and they got together and they made a whole bunch of people's job illegal, thus putting, presumably there were some sex workers who became unemployed as a result of their profession suddenly becoming illegal. I think it's more likely that if we talked to the sex workers, we'd find that most of them just found that their conditions got immediately worse and that their trade got illegal and further marginalized. But, bottom line is, it was a completely ridiculous thing for the State House to focus its energies on in the depths of recession when everybody was worried about getting jobs together. But, they couldn't be bothered to take action on that, so they had to make this illegal. So I'll bet
They took action to take away people's jobs.
Right, exactly.
They took plenty of action.
Exactly. All of it was bad. Right. So it would be interesting to see how this guy, who's apparently being investigated for something, quote, related to do with prostitution, unquote, how he voted on that. But I think further confirmation of his hypocrisy, while certainly satisfying, I don't think is necessary to understand the story. Anyway, so prostitution, and then it came out that he was using the legislative grant program.
The community grants program.
Community grants program, okay.
Which is separate from the legislative grants program. It involves a lot more money, but the money tends to go, and this is a really important distinction to make, the money tends to go to organizations that do some sort of charitable work. Now, not always. It can be used as slush funds to pay off people. There are questions about why exactly Woonsocket got the particular grant it did at the time that it did. So there are some questions that can be raised about the particular community service grants. But it is different from the legislative grant program, which is a case much more clearly of legislative quid pro quo, where it's a way for the speaker to reward legislators who are in with the speaker, because the speaker can say, here, I can give you $3,000 and you can go to a prominent organization in your district that everyone likes, and you can give them $3,000, and then they're going to like you, and then they're going to be more likely to reelect you. And I'm not saying that the program doesn't fund some good groups, but there's an issue with quid pro quo with the program.
Yeah, I think that there's more than just the issue at the legislative level with legislative grants, because you do in fact get people directly using the legislative grants for reciprocal favors. So, for example, I was talking to Jennifer Siciliano, and she was telling me that that a few years back, her opponent did a fundraiser at the Elks Club in Warwick, which was also a recipient of this grant, right? And so that's awfully nice that the people that help you fundraise can directly get money as a result of you getting elected. But it's not really, I wouldn't think, an ethically sound thing to be doing. And the legislative grant program, so legislative grant program, you can just write a check to pretty much whomever, whenever, but they're small checks. Whereas this community grants program, it's a much larger amount of money, but it's nominally supposed to be used for people doing charitable work or other social benefit work. But in fact, as we've discovered this week, there clearly isn't any functional oversight or scrutiny in terms of how these grants get dispersed, because this guy, is it Garrison?
Gallison. I'm just going to push back on that for a second.
Okay.
Because what I'm worried about is that the Speaker's new push to eliminate all these community service grants is really about cutting funding from social service agencies that he doesn't like because they help poor people. And I think it is important to understand that not all the community service grant recipients are bad. And just blanket slashing $10 million that largely does go to help to help people who really need assistance, even though there was this prominent example where a legislator used it for deeply corrupt means, and I think there are plenty of other examples. But that is also true of large other areas of the budget, let's be honest. I think it is a way, I'm worried that it may be a way to simply cut meaningful programs. And in fact...
Just to bring our listeners up to speed here, so I want to make clear what happened. So Gallison was using these community grants. He was apparently funding a charity that doesn't exist, or that does not now exist. And for a number of years, it certainly appears that its only function was to funnel money into his pocket through the vehicle of this state program, and that there was no oversight or scrutiny at all on the disbursement of that money, because it was awarded to him based on his position rather than the merits of the actual organization. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at here, is that is not that we shouldn't give grants to community organizations. Obviously, we should, but that we shouldn't disperse money with no scrutiny and no checking at all, no ethical or systematic controls to make sure that the money actually helps any real people anywhere, rather than just funds the careers of, if not legislators themselves, which is clearly unethical and is pretty egregious, but what is much more common is it funds the salaries of people connected to legislators who can then later on provide them with favors in some other sense. And that's much more ethically murky.
My concern is that what the leadership may well do is slash grants that are useful, grants that are not, maybe grants that maybe should not be slashed, as a way of pretending that they are taking reform action, but in no way address the quid pro quo issues that arise with the whole rest of the grants program. They'll make it look like they're reforming things by cutting things that probably should not need to be cut.
Right.
And so to give a concrete example, there was this program called the Jason Project, which allowed people to go down to URI and watch. It was an educational program for people who use underwater submarines, so that kids could go down and watch underwater submarines while they're going around on the bottom of the ocean. It was an educational program, and it was cut.
Are there other submarines besides underwater ones? Sorry, Sam. Sorry.
Well, so, and I should add here as a disclosure that I actually last October went on a research cruise for my actual job, which used the Jason submarine, but in no way connected to the Jason project that received the grant. The submarine that I was using, I was on a cruise that was using it to retrieve instruments placed on the bottom of the seabed. But anyway, this particular grant program was cut, and I really cannot figure out why. What supposedly was wrong with this program? There was no clear justification. It was yet reported as sort of a positive story. There's reform, they're cutting this grant, it was a positive story. But I think we need to be skeptical. If the speaker starts rolling out and axing new grants, we need to ask, is there something wrong here, or is he just cutting a grant he doesn't like because he doesn't like it for ideological reasons, and it has nothing to do with corruption? So I think that's a really important thing that we have to understand, and we have to be a little skeptical about how the press is portraying this legislative grant program, because it's not clear to me that the press is covering it with a full understanding and a full support for a purely ethics-based reforming of the grants program, rather than seeing some changes that may not in fact improve the program.
Well, I think just your language there about the press is not particularly nuanced or detailed in their analysis of the program, and I'm like, when are they ever? When is the Projo ever? There's a lot of good things, and Bob Plain,
I didn't single out any specific element.
No, you didn't. I did, but you can't put that in Sam's mouth. You can put it in my mouth. But
and just as another disclosure here, I am the Projo's token liberal columnist, so I do a monthly column.
Right. Yes, you're the one that they allow. No, and we've covered in the podcast before. We had Bob Plain on a while back, and he said, right or wrong, the Projo, there's a lot to be said for it in terms of its statewide exposure. There are things the Projo does really well, and we still need the Projo. Our concern isn't that we don't need the Projo; we just need it to be better. You know, so you shouldn't hear my criticism or bitterness as saying, "Oh, we should scrap the paper of record." No, my criticism and bitterness is we should be very cautious about how the paper of record covers certain things. But I think that it's interesting too, because there was a headline over the weekend, and this dovetails into the next thing I want to talk about. But there was a headline over the weekend that said, "Why is Rhode Island politics so corrupt?" or "Why is Rhode Island so corrupt?" Right? And the interesting thing is, I don't think Rhode Island is objectively more corrupt than half a dozen other states.
I totally disagree.
You would be hard pressed to convince me that Rhode Island is more ethical than, say, Florida, or Texas, or Oklahoma, or Kansas. and that it produces better outcomes for its citizens than, say, well, maybe not Illinois as a whole, but certainly in Chicago,
I
it's
think
very
Rhode Island produces
machine-based.
worse outcomes
We can
for
talk
its
about-
citizens than pretty much any other state. I think if you look at policy, objectively speaking, Rhode Island has produced more conservative policy, and particularly conservative on economic issues. And essentially one of the places where conservatism really gets focused is on issues where you have specific special interests pushing for those policy changes. So, for instance, one of the famous pieces of right-wing legislation Rhode Island passed was a ban on cities and towns raising the minimum wage. That was passed because the hospitality lobby wanted to stop a $15 minimum wage for hotel workers in Providence. You look, for instance, at the Commerce Corporation, or as I think it is much more accurately described, the massive expansion of the agency that did 38 Studios, which is
Right.
very much the story that I think was been most undercovered in Rhode Island. What happened is Gina Raimondo decided that her way to reform this troubled agency, which had been giving loans to companies that may well not have deserved them, that couldn't get loans otherwise, was to just switch from giving loans to just directly giving cash grants. And so now in Rhode Island, when you do a development, you get to go to this corporation that is essentially under the control of Gina Raimondo and ask her for money so she can just give cash directly to big businesses. And it's very much a quid pro quo type thing. So it's all legal. There's no illegal activity here that's documented. But it is very much what I would consider legalized corruption.
Well, I think that's certainly true. My point is more about one of the frustrating things as a Rhode Islander that happens is the culture here is almost nihilistic in terms of its attitude towards corruption. And when the Projo comes out with an article like that, I think it encourages that. Instead of saying, why aren't we lining up at the State House with torches and pitchforks to run these guys out of town, it says, well, what can you do? Rhode Island is just born under a bad star, and it's just never going to get any better. And there's unfortunately a resonance to that in our culture. There's a lot of, if you have a conversation with somebody that's not that involved in politics, they have this feeling that Rhode Islanders are so corrupt that the government is not even worth engaging with. And it's interesting to note, you talk about Raimondo, you talk about Mattiello, but Raimondo is widely hated. She has, it would be interesting to see, I imagine there's probably some more unpopular Democratic governor somewhere in the country, but I doubt there are many.
Think so.
A poll just came out that she had a 30% approval rating. It was 31% among Democrats?
Well, no, remember this was a Brown poll that oversampled Clinton voters. It was a Brown
Right.
poll that managed to show Hillary Clinton leading in Rhode Island by 9
Right.
points.
I mean,
when Bernie
honestly,
Sanders carried the
I know
state.
that you work for Brown, and so you can't validate this. Their polling outfit is terrible. I feel like some of those guys just throw darts at a wall
generally,
sometimes.
try and stay out of Brown-related things as a matter of policy, but I think the Brown poll is just so awful. It needs to be criticized. It is a shame and embarrassment, not just to Rhode Island, but to and not just to Brown University, but in some ways it is a real shame to the whole polling industry, just how awful it is. To miss a race by more than 20 points, that is worse than Joe Fleming would do. Right?
Well, bear in mind though, this is not the first time this year.
No,
a major pollster has radically. The big thing that I think is
20 points.
interesting.
No,
The Michigan polling averages were off by that.
But it's different when the
In the
whole
Democratic
industry was
primary.
wrong, right? And this is also a poll, right, where they initially did a poll a while ago where they found Bernie up, and then they redid it, found Hillary up, and then only released the numbers with the headline that Hillary was up, which is crazy. That's just insane. It is.
Well, it's not insane. It's unscientific. But if your goal is to strangle Sanders out of the race, then it's not insane. It makes perfect sense. And I think that's the real reason why nobody's been talking on the back end about why the polls were so wrong in Michigan, because that shows a profound disconnect. That to me shows that a lot of pollsters are trying to set the narrative rather than discover the truth. And so clearly Brown University, I think in this instance they're guilty of that, but a lot of times their polling outfit is just profoundly wrong in a way that doesn't even make any sense to me. It's not even strategically wrong. It's just wrong, But
it is wrong. The one difference here, and I don't want to necessarily say, and certainly there have been people who have reflected on whether incompetence alone could explain this. I think it's possible, definitely, that this could be explained through sheer incompetence. But I do think it is pretty clear that the decision to redo the poll that had Bernie leading and then do a poll with a 2-day callback window, which is sketchy in and of itself, and then just report the second results, is pretty it's
indefensible.
It's pretty indefensible.
Yeah.
But I want to return to a point that I think Grant made earlier, which is this idea that Rhode Islanders view that the whole problem with our state government is corruption and that there's nothing we can do about it. I think it's really important to understand that corruption in of itself is not the direct reason why our economy is a mess. The problem is the policies that our corrupt political system produces, and those policies are essentially the policies of the Republican Party, and I mean the National Republican Party here.
Well, yeah, I think even that is being overly charitable, because you say that your thesis for a long time, and I think you're right. I agree with your thesis. Your thesis has been for a long time that Rhode Island Democrats are just profoundly conservative, and in most states where they would be considered Republican.
No. Rhode Island, the Democrats in the General Assembly. I don't think Rhode Island Democrats are...
No, not Rhode Island citizens, but Rhode Island elected Democratic officials.
The elected Democratic officials who run the Democratic caucuses.
And the unelected, people who are behind the scenes who don't
part of the
hold elected
institutional party.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I think we have to be careful to not lump Rhode Island, the people who are Democrats who hold high positions of power in Rhode Island, particularly in the General Assembly, in with either our federal delegation, which is much more reasonable, or the National Party as a whole, which has its own problems, but it's nowhere near as bad as what we're facing here.
Well, I would agree with that to an extent, but I think that you're too generous both to the National Democratic Party and the congressional delegation.
There are issues with the congressional delegation.
You cannot convince me. I think David Cicilline is a good example of what you're talking about, because I think that I think that he lacks all integrity and character, but
I disagree with that.
He's been a reliable vote for our economic policy, and so if you're willing to accept provisionally that he might be corrupt, clearly his corruption or lack thereof hasn't hurt.
So what evidence do you have of him engaging in any corruption as a congressman?
I'm not saying that
GOP puts this corruption spin on him, and Angel Taveras blamed a lot of Providence's problems on him in a fairly unfair way. And as a result, the public relations was mismanaged, and there's been this perception among a lot of people that Cicilline is somehow this evil, corrupt person, but Cicilline is not.
Well,
there's no evidence to suggest that. It is true that some people who've been involved in politics for a while, Cicilline has not directly challenged the machine, and that's a very valid criticism one could level at him. He has not come out directly and challenged the machine, and he has been occasionally willing to play some of their games. He's made appointments that he probably shouldn't have.
I think the point that I'm trying to make,
he certainly did not make decisions that I would 100% agree with.
The point that I'm trying to make is not to establish whether he is or is not a person of character. Having met him, I'm not impressed, but the point isn't that. The point is as long as he delivers on economic issues and social issues, he's fine. I'm not interested in removing him. But which is kind of getting back to the argument that you were making earlier, that the problem isn't corruption. The problem is the horrific policies that have stemmed or been enabled by the corruption at the state level. And I think that
And I think that's both the
I think you
legal
shouldn't-
and what's illegal.
you shouldn't give our congressional delegation so much of a pass. Obviously, I think Langevin is terrible. And
Jim
you-
Langevin, I think, and very unfortunately, he used to have this idea that he was going to be migrating back towards the National Democratic Party's overall position. But recently, he came out with a number of moves that cut in really the opposite direction. He even suggested a challenge to Nancy Pelosi from the right, which was deeply, deeply inappropriate. And he came out and said some rather awful things about refugees that were totally unacceptable for a Democratic congressman.
That's what I'm getting at, is that you say that our congressional delegation is solid, but clearly Langevin is not.
But here's my point. You know, one of the things that changed, I think, right around the time when Langevin stopped his strategy, and there was a time when it looked like Langevin was going to become pro-choice. I mean, he was dumped from Democrats for life. He even told me once that he's not so conservative on that issue. What was he? He said the words "evolving" to me on that issue. But that's no longer the case. And
Right, he's evolved. Guess what? It's not different at all.
well, but I think the key thing is that we saw machine politics get a lot worse in Rhode Island, move even further to the right with the rise of Mattiella. And I think that Mattiella was very much the reason why Langevin stopped his move to the left. He had faced two primary challenges from the left, both of which he won, and which were not particularly well funded. But all of a sudden, and I think that's what motivated him to move up, but all of a sudden there was this change where the State House moved even further to the right. And I do believe that those pressures bear on our federal delegation. In fact, that the most important thing pushing a federal delegation to the right is the machine in Rhode Island.
I mean, I think that's the most important in the sense that it's the one that we're most able to change. I don't know that if I unpack it, I think the entire Congress is moving to the right in the sense that that they're becoming increasingly obsessed with ignoring the two great issues of our time, which are economic inequality and climate change, right? And I think even Sheldon Whitehouse, who's been
does care about climate change.
I don't know that he does at all, man. I was at his fundraiser, and I think this encapsulates my opinion of the man perfectly. So I was at his fundraiser. I paid $60 to get to his fundraiser. It was a good spread. I mean, it would have been $30 at a high-end restaurant. So I'm sure he made plenty of money off of it, even though they say he doesn't do it to make money. It's more like community outreach. But the point is, I paid $60 to go there. I was at his fundraiser, right? We all got served beer, and you had to, of course, pay for the beer separately. And the beer was served in plastic recyclable cups. But there was no way to recycle them.
No need to be so picky about such things.
I'm not being picky. I'm just saying that
This
I went
sort
to
of
him.
holier-than-thou leftist attitude is not helpful for the progressive movement.
Well, what I'm building to is, Sam, is that I think that his perspective on climate change is very much, and he said it himself, he's not at all interested in any climate change that's going on in Rhode Island. He's
Well, that
only
is
interested
precisely my
in
point.
his Washington
That
BS
is
nonsense.
Precisely my point. Why is he unwilling to take a stance on local climate issues? Because they have a policy of not challenging the machine because they're afraid of them. So this is one more example of, in fact, the machine being the reason why the biggest force pushing our congressional delegation to the right. If Rhode Island had a progressive legislature, or even if Rhode Island had a normal Democratic legislature, I guarantee you we would have a much more progressive congressional delegation with the exact same people. Guarantee you, Jim Langevin would be pro-choice. I guarantee you, Sheldon Whitehouse would be willing to come and talk to local activists and help encourage their climate activism here in Rhode Island.
Right, and that just goes along with what I was saying earlier, is that if everything you say is true, then they're opportunistic, amoral bastards, right? Who don't have any... I mean, if Jim Langevin is pro-choice or pro-life based on which way the wind blows on a given day, if Sheldon Whitehouse's commitment to climate change is as deep as it's easy for him to go without political expediency, then yes, they're opportunistic, amoral people who don't have core principles.
You know, you can.
I'm overstating the case a little bit in Sheldon Whitehouse's case. I mean, I think Sheldon Whitehouse, there's maybe some hope for him. I don't think there's any hope for Langevin, but
I think at some point, the left is going to have to address the Jim Langevin issue, and I think we have bigger fish to fry right now at the local level. In the General Assembly, we need to save the state of Rhode Island because the state of Rhode Island is worth saving. However, it is true that one of the people we are sending to the national level is not someone who fights hard enough for economic growth, fights hard enough to address inequality, and on social issues holds some views that I think are deeply out of step with the people of Rhode Island and are in many ways inappropriate.
yeah, and I think so. Let's move on to the next thing I wanted to talk about. We're talking about out of step with the people of Rhode Island. For those of you who don't know, Rhode Island recently voted by a substantial majority. It was 57 to 43 for Sanders?
It was 12 points, I believe. 12.7 points or something like that. So around 12 points.
Yeah, I think it was 57. Yeah, something like that. So the point is, by a double-digit margin, Rhode Island voters overwhelmingly supported Sanders. And this is in the Democratic primary, which actually it's interesting because some of the national news has described Rhode Island's primary as being closed, which is wrong. But technically, you can't vote unless you're a registered Democrat, but you can register that day. You can affiliate and disaffiliate that day. So if you're an independent, you can go into the ballot box and say, I want to be a Democrat for the next 5 minutes. Vote in the Democratic primary and then move out. But the interesting thing is, so Rhode Island Democratic primary voters overwhelmingly chose Sanders over Clinton. And yet, is there even a single statewide candidate, office holder, appointee? Is there anybody above state senator who's endorsed Sanders? And
No.
yeah, and none of them have changed their opinions, even though it's very clear that a pro-Clinton stance is very much out of step with the opinions of the bulk of Rhode Islanders. So what I think is, and in the last week we've seen Clinton's reaching out to Jeb Bush's fundraising team for help, and Donald Trump says he's all in favor of raising taxes on the rich and the minimum wage, which obviously, I mean, you can't believe a word Troll Boy says, but that's not the point. The point is he's moving himself to the left because now that he's clinched the nomination, he's desperate to seem as palatable as possible. So he's just going to start telling some liberal lies. And Clinton is running from the left as fast as she can now that she feels she's clinched the Democratic primary. So
Is she though? I don't know that we have much evidence that Hillary is yet pivoting to the right. I assume that she will, but I'm not sure that we've seen that evidence yet. I do think it would be the wrong move for her because I think, in fact, Bernie's message resonates a lot better with voters, and he outperforms Trump for that reason. So it does not make sense for her to pivot to the right. But and I think this is really key, there are definitely a lot of people in the DC establishment who forget that most Americans really do agree with Bernie on economic populism issues, do agree, in fact, that we are facing a fundamentally unfair economy and a political system that has serious problems that need addressing. And the attempt of a lot of people in the Democratic establishment to pivot away from these issues, I don't think is going to resonate better with voters. I think it's going to, in fact, hurt us in general elections. And you've seen consistently that more progressive Democrats do better in generals. It's just a very robust, we've just had evidence after evidence. You look at race after race, more progressive Democrats just consistently outperform at the national level. I mean, you just look at people like Mark Begich, compare him to Mark Pryor. Mark Begich was a red state Democrat who ran on a platform of essentially, really addressing some of the fundamental flaws in our economy.
ran a much more liberal platform than any other red state Democrat, and only lost by 2 points in Alaska, which is a really deep red state, whereas Mark Pryor got obliterated in Arkansas. Mary Landrieu got obliterated in Louisiana. Al Franken, who everyone thought was this crazy hippie liberal, no one would ever vote for him, outperformed Obama's 2012 margin in 2014 in the middle of a red wave year in Minnesota, which is a swing state, where in fact the Republicans were taking back control of the Minnesota House of Representatives. Tom Udall in New Mexico, another person who's, well, although he's quieter about it, really does run on economic populism issues, run on addressing our fundamentally unfair economy and political system. He also outperformed Obama in New Mexico in a year in which the Republicans were taking control of the New Mexico House of Representatives. So you look pretty consistently, and Democrats who run on a progressive message just do better in generals. And I think it's a real mistake that some of the Clinton people may be pushing to have her pivot away from the issues that really resonate with the American
Yeah, but
people.
I think that you're assuming that these are smart, strategic people who are taking this position, who are taking all their positions as the result of a deliberate thought process. When I think we saw a very, given the number of missteps Hillary made in the primary, I think it's amazing that she's still the nominee. I think she's been a terrible candidate. She's just not ever been a very good candidate, frankly. And it's in her nature. It's in her nature to run to the right. She's not going to take sincere, well thought out left wing positions in the general. She's just not. I mean, if her only policy goal, as far as I can see it, is to transfer all of our money into the coffers of Goldman Sachs. And I think that dovetails
I think
into...
that is a little bit of an over-exaggeration. I don't think that's her only
You know,
policy.
she talks a good game on climate change, but she won't do anything about it. She opposes a carbon tax, right? She talks a good game about economic inequality, but it's as much her fault as anybody's that economic inequality has gotten as bad as it has.
Drastically overrate the extent to which in real life politicians vote according to their actual values and principles, and the extent to which politicians' values and principles are set in stone. Very much the case, I believe, that people respond to the systems they're in. You know, I think if you put Hillary Clinton in the Rhode Island...
Yeah, I think
Assembly-
a way of unpacking what you just said is that these people are squishy and malleable, that they have no core principles and merely go along to get along. That's my unpacking of what you just said, right? And that's not surprising to me, or I think anybody who's listening at all.
That doesn't mean, that doesn't mean that Hillary Clinton is an ideological conservative or anything like that. She's someone who I think whose policies are a fair reflection of what the Democratic establishment wants at the national level. But it's important to note that that reflection shows a National Democratic Party whose policies are just drastically to the left of what we see here in Rhode Island. Hillary Clinton proposed expanding the estate tax. Nick Mattiello, the Rhode Island Speaker of the House, is now pushing to cut the estate tax, a tax that really only affects millionaires. So at the same time as Hillary Clinton proposed to move in one direction, to do a little bit of something to reform the way our economic system rewards the very wealthy, the House Speaker in Rhode Island, Democratic House Speaker, is moving to help, as he puts it, quote, successful people. But we all know that really means help millionaires.
Help heirs. Help heirs.
Yeah.
Because it's the heirs who would benefit, really.
So, and this is a really important thing to stress. You know, you look at Hillary Clinton is pro-choice. Mattiello and most of the Democrats in the Rhode Island General Assembly are not pro-choice. Hillary Clinton, in fact, opposes the NRA's agenda. Mattiello has an A+ from the NRA. Hillary Clinton...
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about by and large about social issues. I don't want to say that social issues aren't important.
Well,
but
the estate tax is really an economic issue. I consider an economic issue. But look at other tax issues, right? Consistently, Hillary Clinton has towed the National Democratic Party's line on taxes. She voted against the Bush tax cuts for the rich, and has, in general, her policies have advocated for higher taxation on the rich. Now, that is the consensus in the Democratic Party right now. But you look at what they're doing in Rhode Island. The Rhode Island Democratic establishment very much wants to move in the other direction and move in the other direction very aggressively.
That's valid. That's valid. I do think that some of the National Democratic Party's positions they're designed for style rather than substance, but it's a fair point that Rhode Island is far to the right of them. I wanted to talk a little bit more. Mentioning Goldman Sachs reminded me I wanted to talk about the latest debacle. So Gina Raimondo recently was working with, it was her office, right, that was working with Goldman Sachs to get them to bring in some whitewashing money.
Right. I think it is an example of Gina Raimondo's very, very close connections with some of the worst actors in the banking industry.
Right.
And let's be honest here, Gina Raimondo is, in fact, a governor who came from private equity. A business model very similar to the business model that Mitt Romney came from. She came from an industry that charges deeply unfair fees to people, essentially an industry that cheats its customers in order to earn very high profits for very rich people. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the most fundamentally unfair parts of our whole economic system, and let's be honest, that is the industry Raimondo came from, and her hedge fund, her private equity firm, Point Judith, which she still gets paid out of,
right,
has done very poorly.
Yes.
In its investments with the state of Rhode Island, extremely poorly. It also left Rhode Island, a story I think most people forget about, and so, when you look at it, it is important to understand that Raimondo is a politician who's deeply connected with a lot of the people who are pushing for pretty terrible things in our economy. I think it's very much reflected in her policies. She has very much governed really pretty far to the right, in particular in ways that help corporate interests.
Well, I think she's been far to the right on pretty much every issue, but
well, she's really the only social issue she's been conservative on is abortion, where she's been extremely vicious against women's reproductive rights. There's no way to deny that, but it's really the economic.
I wouldn't say that's the only social issue. I mean, I think that you meet intersection of social and economic when you talk about Medicaid cuts.
Right, and it's true. It is true that she broke her campaign promise to provide driver's licenses to immigrants who've been unfairly denied legal status by the U.S. government.
So I'm sure you could come up with some social issue on which she has not reversed herself fundamentally or betrayed her supporters yet. But I think...
Could you, though?
I think you have a pattern already in force of her betraying us on social issues as well. But
that's true.
What I think is so interesting this last week, Go Local reported that the CCRI campus is kicking out a daycare. Community College in Rhode Island is kicking out their on-site daycare. And in addition, they're going to be putting in space for Goldman Sachs to essentially indoctrinate business graduates. I mean, the idea is that they're going to be providing this grant money, and they're these golden saviors. They're trying to get the maximum bang for their buck by going into these local communities, and they're going to provide grants to, quote, entrepreneurs, unquote. But in reality, I think that whether or not this is the explicit goal of the program, they're going to be selecting people who share their values and encouraging their success, because that's just sort of what Goldman Sachs has done down the line. I mean, they stand at the intersection of political and economic power. One of the things that they're most famous for is the ease with which their people move into and out of government office. And they're really aggressively successful governmental and political influence. But what's interesting is that Go Local reported this story that CCRI was kicking out a daycare to make room for Goldman Sachs, and the CCRI, was it the president, got all sorts of butthurt and said, no, we're definitely not doing that. That's false. we kicked out the daycare because we're desperate for space. And then in a completely unrelated note, we're going to make some space for Goldman Sachs, probably somewhere else in the building, right? So the two have nothing to do with each other, which is ridiculous, right? I mean, it's just an absurd way of trying to evade the basic truth of the allegation. But I think you would be hard pressed to find a fundamental disconnect than this, because what you're saying is you're seeing a community college whose stated purpose is to provide education to the community at a low cost and make it available to people so they can better themselves, and you're taking out something that people, working families, desperately need, daycare, so that they can attend college while working, right? And you're taking that out so that you can make room for big business to pick winners and losers with their grants. And of course, they're going to pick winners and losers based not on some objective criteria established by a third party, but basically based on their slavish obedience to a party line. So it's really, I think, a profound betrayal of her office that she's even involved in something like this. And I think incidents like this are why she has such a low approval rating in the state of Rhode Island.
She has a low approval rating, because Rhode Islanders understand that her values are just not consistent with Rhode Island.
I
she's
think
essentially a deeply conservative person.
I think you're still giving her too much credit because you're saying that she has values. I think that she has no principles at all except to enrich herself. Or to advance her ambitions, whatever those may be. But I truly believe that we are not dealing with a person here who has conservative values or liberal values or any principles at all.
She's clearly an economic conservative. She's clearly an economic conservative. Look, she is very consistent.
Oh, that's the outcome. That's the policies that have come out of the office.
Look at the abortion thing, right? She had no real incentive to take a huge whack at a woman's right to choose. It really hurts any national ambition she has. That had to come from conviction. The only place that could have come from is personal values. Personal values that are just deeply conservative and against sort of this modern culture of acceptance of women's health. That's the only place it could have come from.
So here's
it's really hard to explain her social conservatism, which clearly hurts her. On the abortion thing, she pushed so hard that Matty Yellow, of all people, scaled it back. That just shows, it shows that it's really hard to understand Raimondo without seeing an element of true conservative ideology. That was something, Right to Life didn't really do much to help her. And she lost the support from really powerful national groups and really powerful women's groups who now won't be able to support her. NARAL downgraded her rating as a result of that. So it clearly hurt her, but she did it anyway.
I can't explain
that without conviction.
I think that you're overly optimistic in terms of these organizations they're happy to downgrade her and talk about the crisis in Rhode Island when they can fundraise now in an off year. But I think that they'll be happy to endorse Raimondo when she asks for her endorsement again later on, because she's so establishment. And I think a lot of these organizations, they become obsessed with being establishment, being connected to power rather than providing good information for the underlying principles they're supposed to support. Look at Raimondo. I know that we've talked about this before on the podcast, and you've probably heard me rant about this about 5 times, but Raimondo gained the support of Planned Parenthood. They endorsed her in a race where their support was pretty significant. I don't think by itself it gave her the election, but it was a factor in that election. And if the Planned Parenthood had endorsed a different candidate, it's at least conceivable that we might have a different governor now. And at the time, you were trying to tell people, get the message out that, Raimondo isn't solid on choice. Nobody would listen to you. Nobody would give you the time of day. And, if you think about it, Planned Parenthood, they really have 2 core missions. Not that, and this is a slight oversimplification, but their core mission is political advocacy to ensure women's access to choice and providing health care services to low-income women and families, right? And Raimondo has done everything she can to chip away at both of those, and they still haven't repudiated their endorsement of her publicly. All they're doing now is saying, well, Rhode Island is getting an F and we need more money so that we can work to change it. But they haven't walked back their endorsement of her publicly. And I would be very surprised if they didn't endorse her as soon as she went and asked for their endorsement again.
Well, I think it is also important to note that there's a different group right now, Planned Parenthood, than was previously, right?
Yeah, but that's the way it works too. Is you have these institutional operatives, they come into a position, they stay there for a few months or a few years, and then they move on and up, right? They leverage inevitably they circle towards DC, I think. But you have these political operatives, they move about the country. Brown is one of the breeding grounds for this type of political operative too. Sam smiles because he knows I'm right, and he's also a Brown. He's affiliated with Brown. But there are these people that they just go around the country as a hired gun. They work in a place for a brief window of time, and then they leave. And if they cause a mess for somebody else to clean up, oh well, there's never any back check on their resume. All it is was the executive director of this organization in this state, was the director of strategic whatever in this organization for this seat, was chief political organizer in this state, and all they're doing is moving around building their resume and their Rolodex so they can ultimately land some job in DC, whereas they're leaving wreckage in their wake. And so you're saying, oh yes, this thing that always happens, that inevitably always happens, has happened. Yes, is that the people that endorsed Raimondo, they got out before they could be tarred with the consequences of their betrayals, right? They moved onward and upward, but that doesn't surprise me. That doesn't inspire me with hope, right? And when we talk to the new Planned Parenthood group, all I hear is excuses from them. We can't do anything. The National Party sets endorsements. We try to tell them, blah, blah, blah.
Well,
excuses,
to be
excuses.
fair, that is a totally valid excuse. The local had no decision in the presidential race.
Right, so if the local had no decision, right, then why are you telling me I should feel optimistic about the change in the local leadership?
What and I think I'm not saying anything bad about Jamie Rhodes. I think Jamie Rhodes was a great
I can say bad things about Jamie Rhodes.
was a great leader of Planned Parenthood.
I wouldn't say that.
But
These are Sam's views, not mine. Go on.
But I think that it is important to separate what a national affiliate organization does with a local affiliate. But I'd like to return to, I think, what the core issue with Raimondo that a lot of people aren't talking about. It's one of her big policies, and just to return to the beginning, is sending out these enormous cash grants to big corporations. And there's all this scrutiny now over these little cash grants that go to charities. But when we look at the cash grants that all go to businesses that shouldn't get them at all, essentially, pretty much all of these are deeply inappropriate grants.
Right.
A lot of them extensively political in how they're awarded. I mean, there are extensive lobbying efforts.
Right.
I mean, it's all out in the open that these companies go through in order to get money. You can go to the state and lobby and get money. Individuals can also do it through the Student Loan Corruption Program, which no one has ever really covered or particularly looked into. But, high-flying young corporate types of prominently Rhode Island businesses can go and use their political connections to say, please, pay off my student loans. But if you're a poor person and you don't have those connections, you haven't heard of this program, you aren't at a systemically important business, you won't get the money. You can't get the money. So it's this way to do student loan relief only for the people who really don't need it, which is deeply, insulting to students who are suffering, who maybe they can't even get a job because of their student loan debt, right? Maybe their student loan debt prevents them from
the student loan crashes their credit, and there are plenty of employers that won't hire you if your credit's bad.
So it's this ideology that drives it, but it's really important to note that there's this massive program of all of these grants that no one is really scrutinizing. Everyone gets all upset about legislative grants, community grants, where there isn't nowhere near as much quid pro quo type stuff going on as you see out in the open
I
with
think-
the Commerce Corporation,
I think
the
that's-
agency that did 38 Studios, pours enormous amounts of money into corporate welfare, basically because of lobbying efforts.
I think that's it's interesting because I thought, based on our conversations before the podcast, I thought you were going to be the hopeful one, but really you seem like you've got more bad to say than I do, which is a rare thing. We could also talk, although we don't really have time because there's a few more things I want to cover and we're coming up on the end here pretty soon, but we could also talk about at the city level where we had the mayor on tape, if not quite coming extremely close to saying that he was going to roll back and curtail the tax stabilization programs in Providence. And since getting in office, he's done a complete 180 on that. He said now he wants to expand them, and that the city is just going to have to the taxpayers are going to have to make more sacrifices. The school children are going to have to make more sacrifices so we can continue to give these developers free money, even in cases where the development would be done without the money. We still don't want to make those people feel cheated by not giving them free money. So even when they would develop without the money, we're still going to find a way to give them the money. So he's massively expanded the program that he essentially promised to curtail. And we could talk about that. I think that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But I want to get more onto what we're going to do about that. So
Thank you.
What we're going to do about all these issues. So the interesting thing to me is, so we have a lot of fronts on which we need to fight. But
Most important is primary challenges.
I think that we need to be primarying, especially in the legislature, a lot of these establishment Democrats. But I think we do have this unique opportunity right now. We have this brief window, I think, where a lot of Rhode Islanders voted for Bernie. The dramatic majority of Democrats and independents voted for Bernie. And if we can keep those people engaged, if we can turn them out this primary later this year, the primary for the state house and the state races, we're going to have a really good year in that venue. If we can keep those people engaged and keep them turned out.
Keep them working, not
Right.
just turned out, but working on campaigns, running for office. And I have to say, the Bernie campaign has been so inspiring. I think a lot of the 3 announced challenges so far are all Bernie Democrats. But, I know that a lot of the other people who will soon be announcing primary challenges were really invigorated and inspired by the Bernie campaign.
Right,
Who
and-
really got involved through the Bernie campaign. And I think that this campaign is going to have amazing effects.
And we have-
in bringing the political revolution to Rhode Island, a state that desperately needs a political revolution.
I think the phrase political revolution, I'm not a fan of that phrase, but let's
like
just
it. I think
let's
it's
just go
important.
with the narrative. Let's all say political revolution.
I like it because
let's use
it-
the same language, even if
It shows that what we're trying to do is fundamentally change the system, right? The idea is to say we're not pushing for incremental change. What we're going to do is we are going to change the way, or at least what we're trying to do is we're trying to put in place Democrats, actual Democrats. We're trying to put in place people who have very, very different views and policies from the people who've been running the state, who are essentially very right-wing Republicans.
And I think that, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think that the thing that I object to about the word revolution is that revolution is transformational and structural change. It's not exercising the power assigned to you by the system to modify the system slightly, right? So I think that it's great. I think we can use the term political revolution, right, to describe this, because it really is fascinating how we have a lot of candidates who are going to be coming up this year, primarying establishment Democrats who aren't really Democrats at all, as we've discussed, who come from a variety of backgrounds. To wit, they are not all rich, inbred lawyers, which is amazingly different than the current composition of the State House.
There are many members of the State House who are not inbred. I think the
By
vast
inbreeding, I use the term inbreeding as, just so you know, podcast listeners, when I say inbreeding, I don't actually mean that they are the product of brother-sister copulation. What I am saying is they come from a lineage of wealth. Their true job description is heir, right? And they never brand themselves as heir. They invariably brand themselves as lawyer and or business person, but their true job description is take the money from daddy and make it grow more by using daddy's Rolodex, right? Take daddy's law practice and continue to work those clients, right? So when I say inbred, I don't actually mean, the buck-toothed, stereotype. What I mean is inbred in the sense that the royalty of Europe was inbred back in the Middle Ages, where because all of these rich people, all they do is pass their money to their children, and they view themselves as a class apart. You see a lot of very tight-knit organizations that freeze out everybody else and that live in a totally disconnected bubble from the vast majority of citizens.
Right.
So, do I actually believe that they're the product of genetic inbreeding? No, that's not what I mean. But I think that they're disproportionately lawyers and heirs, or heirs, I should say. And I don't think we have a single person who's an heir running. And I think that we have maybe one lawyer. We have the right percentage of lawyers running. I don't want to say there should be no lawyers, but if lawyers are, say, 5% of the population, they should be 5% of the state reps.
Lawyers are not, in fact, 5% of
No.
the population. It may seem that way if you get involved in politics in Rhode Island, but it is not, in fact, the case.
Right, but you see what I'm saying. I'm not saying we should have no lawyers. I'm just saying they shouldn't be so
I think
drastically
it's fine to
overrepresented.
have. I mean, lawyers they're always going to be some overrepresentation of lawyers in politics.
That's probably true, and don't even necessarily think that's a bad thing.
And I think there are plenty of good politicians who are lawyers. Elizabeth Warren, for instance, is a lawyer, and I don't think there's anything wrong.
Well, I think that the problem is that the successful politicians are so commonly lawyers that any good one you find, it's like saying 60% of this group is good. You're drawing your little Venn diagram, right? And your Venn diagram has overlap because a huge percentage of the people who are elected as politicians also come from a background of being lawyers and or heirs, right? And so, yes, there are certainly some good lawyers and or heirs that are successful politicians, but there are plenty of other people who would be really great politicians that don't get the opportunity because they're not a lawyer and or heir, right? And that's kind of more the point that I'm making. It's not that lawyers are bad. It's just that we're all stocked up. We have enough. We definitely need to have people with that expertise in the State House, but we have way too much replication of that expertise and not enough, community organizers or planners or working class folks or just people from a variety of backgrounds. Tradespeople, professors, we're underrepresented in a lot of those areas. So we have a diverse group of people coming up, and it's going to be our challenge to keep the Bernie supporters focused on that, keep them engaged. And I think the challenge for you and I specifically, and for the Progressive Dems, which is the Rhode Island Progressive Dems is kind of the reason we know each other, is how do we become, we have a lot of work to do as an organization to become the standard bearer, right? Because I think in the next few months we're going to see a lot of people, we've always seen, we've in the past had to kick people out because they were so intent on branding themselves as progressive when not a single policy they advocated for was in fact progressive. They just wanted to control the label, right? And I think that's going to be a challenge we're going to have as we have all these other organizations that are going to try to claim for themselves the right to pick who is a progressive or not. And they're going to be people that are going to say that Nick Mattiello is a progressive. So we need to also be cautious of that because, unfortunately, we have a lot of Bernie voters. I think a lot of citizens generally who just don't have the time and energy to become as informed about this as we all do. And that's why things like the Planned Parenthood endorsement, that's why I harp on that, because people don't have time or energy to do their own digging. They rely on organizations to parse data for them, and so we need to find a way to be the guys that hand out that progressive label.
Yeah, I don't.
Not us specifically. We have a great team. I think we could hardly have a more ethical or trustworthy and passionate group of people than we have in Progressive Dems. It'd be nice if we were a little more racially diverse, but apart from that, we're pretty clutch. We're a pretty good group of people, and there are other organizations that are a lot more compromised than us that are competing for that right to be the one who gets to select who's the progressive and who's not. I'm sorry, I've talked for a while. You wanted to speak.
Well, I'm always happy, letting you talk. There's nothing wrong with you talking. So yeah, I think just the core thing to remember is that Rhode Islanders have the ability to change our government. And it's easy to look and say Rhode Island's problems are all based off corruption and there's nothing we can do about it. But in fact, the issue is the conservative policies that the special interests are pushing. And those policies come from electing right-wing politicians, and we can oust those politicians in primaries and we can elect real Democrats. And we're going to have a chance to do that in September.
Well, that's very exciting, I think. Boy, I mean, I know I promised to leave you on a down note, so let me think of something really bitter and depressing here. I think that it's going to be difficult because even though we have this tremendous opportunity because of the tremendous unpopularity of the state government right now that provides us with this opportunity, and of course the success of the Bernie campaign, I think on the other hand, we have to find a way to do it this year. We can't wait even 2 years because a lot of these problems that we're dealing with, they're working hard to bake them all in now before they lose power. And so we have to do everything we can, not only to stop Mattiello from raising the estate tax this session, but to make it impossible for him to raise it again later, or raise the estate tax cap, I should say, because obviously he wants to lower the estate tax. But we need to make it not only focus on trying to frustrate him at the legislative level this year, but also we need to make it impossible for him to do it again next year. I think these people, they've read the shock doctrine, and they finally figured out that the way to push forward really unpopular change is to do it in extremely rapid succession through profoundly undemocratic means before people have time to mobilize and react. And we have to deprive them of that opportunity, not just these years, but in years to come. And the only way we're going to have the ability to do that is if we really get a good team of people in to the State House to frustrate them. Because even right now, I think we do have a few progressive allies in the State House, but by and large, they're either quite marginalized and ineffectual, or they're a little bit too willing to work with the machine. And we don't want to work with the machine. We don't want to transform the machine. We want to break the machine. And so we need people that share that goal, and we need them now, because if we don't find a way to break the machine, it's gonna be too late. Once that natural gas facility, for example, goes in Burrillville, it's not going away. Once the liquefied natural gas plant goes in the south side of Providence, it's going to stay there for 20 years until the reports of local pollution create another Superfund site. But the damage will already been done at that point. It's going to be very difficult to make the tax code more progressive in the near term, right? But we need to hold the line on keeping it from becoming even more regressive and being used as an excuse to cut deserving programs like, I have no doubt, this Jason underwater submarine program that you discussed earlier, and a lot of other small-scale grants. People doing really fascinating and valuable things for the state that need funding, but are now being targeted where the leadership, as you say, is just, they view this whole corruption scandal as just one more crisis they can exploit to shock us with more unpopular changes.
Right, and I think it's important for voters to be skeptical of the way the leadership says they're reforming things. Very interested to see what's going to be in Mattiello's supposed ethics reform bill that comes out on Tuesday. I think we're going to have to examine that very closely, and I don't think we should start off by saying, oh, he's doing an ethics bill, let's just assume it's good. You're gonna have to dig into it, see what it actually does.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big challenge. Is sometimes people find it difficult to engage with me because I seem knee jerk, right? But really, if Mattiello provides an ethics bill, there's no reason to believe that it'll make things better, right? There's every reason to believe that it'll be some sort of backdoor way of making things worse. It's just like if Raimondo announces a new business development program, there's no reason to believe that it'll actually help Rhode Islanders who aren't already rich, And so I think that a sort of knee-jerk skepticism and sort of aggressive mistrust is quite warranted given the past behavior we've seen from Mattiello, from his cronies up there at the State House, and from Raimondo and her entire administration. So, all right, is there anything else that you want to say of a bitter and depressing nature before we sign off here, Sam?
Well, no, I want to thank you for having me on. It's a real honor, and
Yeah, it's an honor.
It is an honor. You've had an excellent lineup of guests.
No, sir, you honor me. Well, thank you so much for being part of the podcast. This is going to go up on RI Futures. This is going to be the first time anyone outside of my little circle is going to hear it. So it should be interesting to see the feedback I get. I assume that most of it will be negative, but I invite negative criticism as always. I mean, really, negativity is sort of what we're all about here at the Grim Wisdom Podcast. So thanks so much for listening in. Thanks again to Sam for being part of it today, and have a great day.
All right.